Welcome to the fourth edition of the Culture Summit Abu Dhabi. I'm Fiammetta Rocco. I'm a senior editor at The Economist and the paper's culture correspondent. Our session today, which is hosted by The Economist, is the post-COVID cultural economy. What will it look like and how can it thrive? With me to discuss this huge question is Deeyah Khan, one of the world's most successful documentary filmmakers. She's won 27 major awards, including 2 Emmys. She's also the founder of Fuse, a media and arts company that puts women, people from minorities, and third culture kids at the heart of telling their own stories. John Newbigin is the Mayor of London's Creative Industries Ambassador. He's also chair of the British Council Advisory Board for Arts and the Creative Economy, at a time when the creative industry's contribution to the world economy cannot and should not be underestimated. Last but not least, Vicky Featherstone, artistic director of the Royal Court Theatre in London, a small theatre with a very big voice. Vicky, as many of you know, has been one of the stalwarts, one of the RSJs, if you want to use a building term, of the cultural economy during the pandemic. And I'm sure she'll have a lot to say about what will be needed to help it thrive in the weeks and months ahead. Now, we've all seen what's happened to the cultural world over the past year. Empty cinemas, shut down theatres, art galleries that are shuttered, dancers being forced to train alone in their kitchens for fear of losing condition. We know why it's happened. But I think it's worth looking again about what it's actually meant on the ground, if only as a place to start. Now, Deeyah, I want to begin with you. How has the cultural landscape that you inhabit been transformed particularly by the economic strains of the coronavirus?
Thank you very much for having me. So in addition to making documentary films, I also do a lot of work with artists around the world. And I also do some work with UNESCO around artistic freedom and creativity. And so within that context, I've had the opportunity to stay in touch with very large networks of artists and cultural workers globally. And to be honest with you, I mean, it's in the short term and also in the middle term, I think that the outlook for the global cultural economy, it's devastated. I mean, its entire ecosystems of culture and cultural output it's just vanished. And we've got younger people that can no longer participate or continue their education and their involvement in the arts. And, wherever the economic impact has been stronger, which is, for the most part in the global south, is where we're seeing that the cultural economy hasn't just been negatively affected, but I think the return to anything that looks like normal or back to how it used to be, I think is actually not realistic. I think it's been extinguished to such an extent that to rebuild and recover from this is going to be very, very hard. Having said that, we've seen that the global platforms, streaming platforms have done very well. We've seen that the music streaming services have done very well. But what that does, as wonderful as that is on one hand, but they're also then determining what kind of content can be created. What is it that is going to have a worthy life? To be able to connect with audiences in the future. And one of the things I'd like to just mention very briefly, if you don't mind, is there's another impact that the pandemic has had on the cultural and art sector globally, which is that we've seen a lot of artists being targeted. In the global south in particular, we've seen a lot of artists be imprisoned, and we've also seen a lot of artists and cultural workers actually be killed. So while the rest of the world has been looking the other way or been looking in our own context, human rights abusers and those who abuse power have taken this opportunity to also target cultural workers in this very, very awful way. So I think that the impact has been on multiple layers, and the devastation is not something that we're going to recover from anytime soon.
Vicky, I want to bring you in here because the Royal Court is in the centre of London. It may be a small theatre, but of course it has very long arms, and it's been sheltering a lot of people, both nationally and internationally, not physically, but culturally, emotionally, intellectually. From your standpoint, what is the outlook for the global cultural economy? I mean, can what's lost been recovered? This is what Deeyah's talking about, or has it gone forever?
Thank you, Fiammetta, and thanks, Deeyah. I agree entirely about the devastation, of course. But we're at a crossroads, aren't we now, where we have a set of decisions that we can make, both kind of locally, nationally, and internationally. And the decisions are: do we?
Vicky, can you turn the volume up a little bit?
Yeah, sorry.
Just a little bit hard to hear you. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah. No, that's what you've got to say is so important.
I've never been told I'm too quiet before, so that's. But I think that we're at a crossroads, and I think we have a decision to make. And as Aaron Dutty-Roy said earlier in the pandemic, the pandemic creates a portal that we go through. And do we want to return to a normality, or do we want to make change happen? And art and culture is always about innovation. And I think that we're at a moment where we are learning different ways of communicating with each other. There's a more democratic flatness in some ways in terms of the way that we collaborate. Our conversations that we've been having with our international writers and our international partners have been extraordinary at this time. We've never been able to have such a connection with them. And there's a kind of equality in the way that our international writers have mixed with our British writers in talking about ideas and coming up with ideas. But the choice that we have is, are we going to hold the hand and support culture to move into the phase when it can feel more successful, more supportive, more funded again? Or are we going to let it go backwards? And of course, change is always terrifying for people. And the funding and the support for culture often comes through institutions and systems, and they've been under threat. The individual talent will not disappear, but are we in a position where we can join together and create the platforms for people to kind of exceed their potential and tell us the stories that need to be told now about our humanity with freedom of speech more than we've ever needed it?
John, you look at this from a political perspective. I mean, that's not one of the things that Vicky talked about, but that is the background against which all this is being viewed. And for you, it's not just of London, but also the world beyond, whether it's Abu Dhabi or India or China. If the short-term outlook that Deeyah describes is so bleak for the global cultural economy, what do you see in the medium and long term? What are the trends there?
Sure. Thanks, Fiammetta, and a pleasure to be on this call. Seems to me one of the paradoxes is that although the whole cultural world has been so devastated by COVID, one of the things that's been very clear is that cultural activity and the creativity within communities has been manifest in a way it never has been before. And the importance of culture in sustaining community solidarity and emotional well-being is clearer than it's ever been before. I think in the longer term, what we do know is that the creative industries, and I'm not equating the creative industries with culture, but the cultural and creative economy, as the UN defines it, is one of the fastest growing sectors in the whole world. South as well as north, east as well as west. And in fact, it's in the global south where change is happening most quickly. And that's partly because of improving education standards up until COVID anyway. And it's partly because of the increasing ubiquity of smartphones of one kind and another. And I'm just involved at the moment in setting up a Creative Central Asia network. It's about 1,000 entrepreneurs in the 5 Central Asian countries who are passionate about the cultural and creative future of their countries and their economies. And just to pick up on something that Deeyah said, which is that many artists have had not just a bad time in the last year, but have been literally imprisoned, killed, threatened, endangered. And one of the things that strikes me increasingly in things that I do all around the world is that cities are becoming the crucial players in thinking about cultural policy. There are, UNESCO's got 180 cities in the Creative City Network. In Indonesia alone, Indonesian Creative Cities Network, 200 cities, World Cities Culture Forum, 50 members, and so on. And increasingly, what interests me is that very often where the national government has not been particularly supportive of culture, and I'm thinking of Brazil, the US, India, Eastern Europe, city mayors are out there flying the flag saying the creativity and culture of our community is one of the things that distinguishes us. And I think in the future, building a post-COVID economy, that sort of distinctiveness and cultural distinctiveness of cities is going to be something which will be one of the real positives that we have to build on.
Tell us very quickly a little bit more about your Central Asian network, just as an example, because it strikes me that not only is it the sort of network that can stand in where there is national weakness of representation, but it's also the kind of network that can help protect individual artists from the sort of things that Deeyah was telling us about.
Well, at government level,
and obviously it can be replicated elsewhere. It doesn't have to be Central Asian. That's why it's so interesting.
Sure. I mean, at government level, one of the things that they are doing is looking at the UAE, and which is thinking about how do you create a post-oil economy. A country like Kazakhstan, which has got huge mineral wealth and is living off that at the moment, they're very conscious of the fact that that is not going to last forever. And resource depletion and climate change are driving that. They've got to think about what they're going to be doing economically, as well as what their cultural distinctiveness is going to be. So that's one of the drivers for it in Central Asia. But I think also there's a recognition they've got China on one side, Russia on another, Turkey in the south. They need to be able to assert their own cultural distinctiveness, and they're recognizing that by working together they can do that. I mean, God knows they've got plenty to struggle with in those 5 Central Asian countries, but for me it's a really interesting mixture of people who see the economic potential of creativity and culture, and people who want to push the boundaries in terms of cultural expression and freedom of expression. There's a whole generation of young people with a much broader understanding and set of ambitions about the world, partly because they're online. And they are not prepared to put up with the way things have been in the past. They really want change, and they want to say who they are, and they want to engage with the world. And I think that's, I mean, funnily enough, I just feel at the moment, the further away I am from Western Europe, the more optimistic I begin to feel. It just feels like there is real energy in Asia, in Latin America. I mean, I've got the people in the Indonesian government and people in the Colombian government talking to each other, because I thought in terms of cultural policy, actually, for all the negative things one could say about both those countries, they're really engaged at government level in thinking about this stuff. And I'm not pretending that's a kind of utopia around the corner, but I'm saying there are grounds for being positive and pushing hard for those changes to be endorsed and recognized as part of policy. And then just, a very final issue, but this year, the UN is marking it as the year of the creative economy's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, creativity and culture as crucial to resolving not just the emotional well-being of our societies, but the fact that we are going to have to change the way our economies work, because otherwise we really are facing a very, very grim future because of climate change and resource depletion.
Well, creativity at the root of that. And that's so interesting what you have to say about that. I mean, one of the things that I became very conscious of a year ago when we shut down in writing about culture was the extent to which cultural coverage, at least in the West, had been pushed by PRs, by marketing, by new exhibitions, new shows, new. And at a time when you couldn't go to anything and all that marketing hype was to no avail, the number of writers and artists and filmmakers who simply went into the studio or the study or shut the door and got on with it, just as a sort of as necessary as breathing for them, that going into their workplaces to create was what really kept them alive. Deeyah, you're one of those artists. Are we going to see an absolute... Sorry, one's children. They're such a pain.
I completely relate.
Man, that's about the 3rd time she's wrong today already. Knowing I can... Anyway, a glut of creativity. Are we going to see... I know that there's a lot of creative stuff is banked up, But are we going to see in a year or two that this last year will have produced an extraordinary amount of new and different work from artists who, many of whom, were as busy as everybody else and finally had time?
I think so. My feeling is absolutely that. I think, one thing that artists do and have always done, regardless of the art form and the sort of creative art instruments that we use, is that whenever there is a compression, whenever there is resistance, whether it comes to societal pressures, economic pressures, emotional barriers, whatever that compression might come from, the desire and the impulse to create as a form of resistance in the face of that compression has always been incredibly fertile and incredibly rich. I think any time of sort of deprivation and constraints will always produce incredible art. So yeah, I utterly agree with you. I do think that in the coming years, as much as the economic part of it is going to be challenging, I do think in terms of the flow of creativity and brilliant works, not just of artists who have been busy doing, and now maybe have time to think and feel about what else they might actually want to create. But I also think that to Vicky's point about younger artists, I think there are a lot of younger people who also are creating, whether they get a platform and an outlet for their creativity, who knows? But there is a lot of interesting work, I think, going on as a direct response to COVID. And I think one of the points that, John was making earlier, I think cannot be underestimated. I don't know how many of these panels that I've been on where people are sort of trying to understand, well, why does a cultural economy matter? Why does art actually matter? What is it? What do we care? It should always, people always seem to think, and governments often show us as well, whenever there are economic problems, historically, one of the first things to go or be limited is the cultural sector. Because I think that the way that art and culture is viewed is with a certain level of disrespect and contempt and kind of it's not that important. It's just a luxury. And in my experience, and the truth of it is, and COVID has proven this to us, art and culture and creativity has been the oxygen that has kept all of us alive.
Absolutely.
We've all turned to books, we've all turned to stories, we've all turned to music to keep us emotionally. Our internal survival has depended on that. Our physical survival has depended on our NHS and our health workers and our frontline workers. But our emotional well-being has absolutely been kept alive because of the art that we're able to immerse ourselves into. So why does art matter? Why does a cultural economy matter? It's because it's what makes us human. It is what reminds us of our own humanity and each other's humanity. And in a time where our societies are becoming increasingly divided, increasingly polarized, increasingly fractured and distant from each other, not just because of COVID, but because of our political rhetoric and atmospheres, we need art actually more than ever to help create those bridges of understanding and those bridges of empathy and connection with each other, and reminding us what we actually have in common. And art is one of those spaces. I do work both within sort of straddling media and art, and I find journalists to do incredibly important work and political activists to do incredibly important work. But what artists do is that they hit the emotional register and the human part of us. And that, in the face of the kind of challenges that we're up against, I think will keep us sane, keep us connected to each other, and I think will help us rebuild our economies from this as well, like John was saying. Sorry.
No, that's so eloquent. And I want to bring Vicky in here because she knows a lot about this. Because while the pandemic caused a lockdown, counterintuitively, it also has opened up new connections between cultural institutions, their audiences, their makers, between the theatre and playwrights, between book festivals and audiences, between orchestras and listeners, all over. So the Royal Court has, you touched on this very briefly, Vicky, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about it. It has completely revamped its international writing program. Tell us a little bit more about this as an example of not change so much, but of intuitive evolution as an example of a new way of working?
Yes, I mean, there's always, you know, the Royal Court has had an international programme running extraordinarily and brilliantly, supported by so many international institutions and the British Council, of course, for nearly 30 years. But it's always been about us going to countries, working with people who are aspiring writers in different countries. Traditionally, we've always worked in countries where there is a less developed theatre tradition, but is that a less developed Western theatre tradition? Is that something that looks like ours? And of course, we're on a big conversation kind of institutionally about decolonisation and about what does that mean and what is the resource that the Royal Court can bring but not impose. So our international programme over this time has been able to be hugely democratised, because we're not going and teaching people how to write. We're inviting people to come and have conversations with us and with our British writers. So the work that we're doing is taking on a whole different view, because we're no longer intimidated by Zoom, by this kind of online in-depth conversation workshop. So in terms of our sustainability, you know, the Royal Court is a net zero theatre this year, and will continue to be. In terms of our sustainability, it's also really, really vital to that, and to all of, and in terms of accessibility as well, even who's able to come into our building. So it's kind of shifted enormously the way that we work. At the moment, that is really exciting and encouraging, and there are a lot of partnerships developing. It's exciting and encouraging because we've been able over this year, because of our amazing donors, to be able to fund that work. But one of the big questions I have, and kind of picking up from what Deeyah was saying, is, you know, a lot of the work that people have done kind of privately has not been monetized. It's not work that they've necessarily been paid for. It's not work that they're on a kind of financially sustainable place to be able to deliver. So while I think the creativity is extraordinary and the innovation is extraordinary, and there are so many lessons to learn, there are great partnerships emerging. I mean, in the West is, you know, with like Sky Arts, with Netflix, all of those things to kind of support artists and awareness of those younger emerging artists and the kind of fragility of the landscape that we have built over so many years, thinking it was so safe and so secure. The question is, how do we just support that innovation going forward, and not retrench from that into a normality, which is about how many bums on seats are we going to get?
I want to come on to the whole financial aspect of this in just a second, but before you go, what does it mean politically to have the sort of technological and intellectual connections with writers, many of whom are going to be living in or come from countries where the political regimes are really clamping down?
Yeah. You know, I mean, the Royal Court has always been about freedom of speech and about the voice of the artist. That's what it was created to be in 1956, and our mission has never ever changed. Where in the past internationally we've gone into countries and worked quite quietly with people where they don't necessarily have the freedoms that we have in Britain. Now those writers have been able to connect up with other writers globally and have much more supported, much more sophisticated, much more political conversations around what is your voice, what is your work, or how do you want to communicate, and that has become an incredibly important part of the work that we do. But picking up from what Deeyah was saying and also what John was saying, you know, we work with writers around the world who are scared to say what they need to say, who live in fear in a small space now, locked in, trying to communicate and trying to write, sending us their work. We recognise our privilege at the Royal Court, and we try to support those writers as much as possible. But this time hasn't made that any easier for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Vicky, let's go on just to what you were talking about before, which is money. There's going to be much less money around, at least for a while, and obviously very, very fierce competition for resources. How do you think institutions should adapt to a new funding paradigm? I mean, you're part of a formal discussion, I think monthly, is it, with David Vann and other senior theatre people about their experiences. What are they saying about how institutions should adapt?
Was that to me or John? Sorry.
It's to you.
Oh, to me.
Both of you, but we'll start with you. Yeah.
Well, I think, again, it's about innovation. It's about finding different ways of working. It's hugely about partnerships. I think in terms of talking about Britain or England specifically in terms of culture, I think there is a very important conversation about what culture is, and culture isn't the preservation of our heritage as it's being suggested currently. How do we? Yes, are we allowed to look at our past, but how do we preserve the notion of what it is to be English and what our heritage is? Culture has to be about standing on the shoulder of giants and moving forward. So we have to be able to move forward in a funding framework which is looking to challenge the status quo, which is looking to ask the questions of who we are, and that must be fearless. And in terms of kind of philanthropic giving and donations and our relationships with organisations, there are some incredibly sort of groundbreaking trusts and foundations that can support and do support the work that we're doing, but the demand on them is getting higher and higher and higher, and obviously their endowments, their incomes are reducing. So there is a big crisis there, and I think going forward there'll be more and more pressure on individual philanthropists who will be asked to kind of support morally with their wealth in terms of what they believe culture is and our humanity and our kind of shared empathy. So there is a greater pressure on it than there has ever been.
And from the yes, John, I was just going to come to you.
Well,
from the government standpoint or the sort of political standpoint.
I was just going to pick up on what Vicky said, which seems to me there's no shortage of money around in the arts. I mean, Sotheby's just sold 2 paintings for $100 million a piece in the UAE, and Jeff Bezos made as much money in a week as the entire global arts world has made in a year, probably. So the issue is distribution of resources and the power of the platforms. I mean, the fact that COVID has made the platforms to prosper massively. In the UK, video streaming services up more than 70% in 1 year. It's the live performance, it's the interaction with the artist that's been suffering. And where there has been government support in the UK, but I think in most countries, the support has gone to institutions, not to individuals. And it's somebody in the UK said, when the government said very proudly they're supporting the crown jewels of culture, but the crown jewels of culture are the artists, and we're not supporting them. And I think that the fact that the big platforms, that their algorithms dictate what we see increasingly. They're shaping what happens, and they're retaining the money. And the big thing that we have to address is how we redistribute the resources that are still flowing into the consumption of arts and culture. And I think one thing, The Economist magazine has made a big point about how medicine has gone online big time in the last year because it's had to. I think the same thing's been happening in the arts world. Of course, the live performance, the live interaction is never going to be anything other than at the core of arts, because it's about storytelling, it's about the engagement of people. But given that these online platforms are so crucial, one of the things that seems to me is going on is that some arts organizations are beginning to understand that, as well as working out ways to make their content available online, it's using the data. They have to own the data that's being generated by that. Otherwise, it's Eventbrite that prospers. It's Google and Yahoo that prosper. And I think for cultural and arts organizations to be much more sophisticated in how they think about the online world and how to monetize content online is something we're just at the beginning of. I won't go on about it, but it's exactly the same story with copyright in the 19th century. It took 100 years for authors' rights to really be properly established. The great American writers, Melville and Longfellow and Emerson, they were paying their publishers to publish their work. And Dickens only made money in the US by doing live performances. Like a band today, he couldn't make any money out of his writing because everything was being pirated left, right, and center in the US. He went and did live tours and was attacked by many people in America, being this kind of, this troublemaker from England who thought that authors should have some of the benefit of their publications. What a nonsense. It all belonged to the publishers. And it wasn't until the Berne Convention whenever it was 1889 or something like that there was any kind of international understanding about the need to reward creative writers and not just reward the publishers and booksellers.
That's so true. Now, Deeyah, I want to ask you as an artist how you see this, because while there's a question about regulation and about ownership of data, it's true that online offerings, social media, a huge range of these incredibly quickly evolving technologies are bringing new audiences to even the smallest organizations. How, as an artist, as a filmmaker, as somebody who works with other teams of artists, how should these voices be amplified?
I think it is an incredible opportunity that now we have this sort of direct line of communication with our audiences, where we're not sort of dependent or limited by sort of the traditional gatekeepers that used to be very present. But still, I think that the problem remains is, there is so much content out there now online. There is it's so much saturation of content. So to be able to stand out in this mass of sound and creativity is difficult. So I think that the responsibility is sort of an additional responsibility that is being placed on artists, is that, we also now have to know how to market ourselves. We have to, do social media. You have to, and I understand that that's the world that we live in, but I, for example, I actually struggle with it. I have a really hard time to sit on Twitter or sit on Instagram and to constantly be creating content just for social media to eventually drive it to the actual work that you do. So I actually fail miserably as an individual artist.
You find it distracting, or do you find it?
I find it very distracting. I find it distracting. I find it sapping of my energy. But also, I'm not a marketing person. That's a skill set in and of itself. I tell stories and make films, or I make music, or it's my kind of skill set is that. It's not to come up with the pithiest tweet. And the shortest, punchiest, whatever little slogan thing, it's hard. And I've spoken to other artists who also find it really difficult, but you don't have a choice. And I've even spoken to younger artists, because I was like, well, okay, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm just getting too old, and I've just sort of missed the boat a little bit. And I've spoken to really young artists, musicians, and they just, some of them have no social media, because they're like, look, I just want to write songs. I just want to play. I just want to make music. I don't want to sit there and also have to be a salesperson for what I do. So I think it's sort of, it's a huge benefit, and it's also a bit clumsy for a lot of artists. So yeah, there are huge benefits, but I think kind of practical struggles in there as well. And I think also the kind of the other flip side of it is a lot of artists are also targeted, and a lot of women artists are also targeted and harassed online. So it's a fantastic space, but I can't tell you, I have lost count, and the police have lost count of how many death threats I also get online because of the work that I do and because I'm a woman. And so the threats of sexual violence, and for very many women who are not fortunate enough to live in countries like I get to live in, those threats online and that harassment online, the bridge between that and it transferring into offline harassment and threat and violence is very, very real. And that distance is actually quite short. So yay, social media, but it's also it's a way to surveil people as well. We have people that are in prison because of what they posted online, or artists might have said something critical of a government or of a corporation even, and they, pay the price for that because it is so visible now. So does that answer your question? So I think it's a mix, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Social media as opportunity, social media as trap. I mean, Vicky, for an institution,
I think it's all of that.
It's all of that, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's all of that. And I think, and going back to what, John was saying about the streaming platforms, having been on some of the streaming platforms myself, it's, as he was saying, the profits that companies like that are making are just astronomical. But I think what the artists and the creators are gaining from it is there's no change in that. And especially looking at the music streaming services, I mean, it's been very, very problematic, the kind of remuneration or the lack of remuneration when it comes to musicians on these platforms. So I think there are huge sort of challenges ahead and issues that need to be addressed, and artists that need to become organized and really start confronting some of these, big companies that are doing us a huge favor on one hand, but, favor and exploitation, it's that line can get a bit fuzzy, and we have to be very aware of that.
And it's not just individuals, it's also institutions. It's not just opportunity for institutions, it's also something that needs to be policed, that institutions need to protect their own staff from. Vicky, how do you weigh up that balance of needs between needing social media to amplify your voice and yet protecting your own staff from its dark underside?
Well, it's very interesting because, when Deeyah's talking, she's talking about kind of individual artists making work alone in the world. Whereas one of the things about an institution like the Royal Court is that it's our responsibility to nurture and create a safe space for those artists. So we don't ask artists or writers ever to speak to the press unless they want to tweet about their work. We have a department of people who represent that on their behalf, but they're okay. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that is so important that there is that barrier, that we take responsibility for the context that the work goes out in, and the artist is free to make the piece of work that they want to make. So I think that's a kind of huge difference there. The sort of one of the positive things, obviously, we all often deal with the kind of negative around social media, but one of the major positive things is, for example, that a play that I directed 3 years ago, Cypress Avenue, by David Ireland, about the Troubles in Belfast.
I was just thinking about exactly when you were saying, yeah.
Well, that Stephen Ray was in, we performed that in Ireland and in Belfast, and in the theatre upstairs at the Royal Court. It went to America. So that was like 2 versions of it, and it probably reached a few thousand people. The BBC then filmed it for us, and it's subsequently been seen by 450,000 people in over 30 countries. So that would never have happened with that piece of work, which is about intolerance and about the situation in Northern Ireland. So actually, when work can be held in the right way, it can access a much, much wider audience who would never, ever dream of or be able to come to Sloane Square and see that piece of work at the Royal Court. So as Deeyah says, there are positives and negatives, but I think institutions need to take major responsibility for supporting the artists to not have to take responsibility for their work.
Yeah. Now, we don't have a long time left, but post-COVID cultural world, if over the next 12 months, you want to achieve something or you want to see something achieved, what would it be? Vicky, let's start with you.
I would, mine is probably quite simple. I would like the extraordinary work that the writers that have been developing over this time to be able to be programmed confidently, for us to be able to go forward confidently, because I think the message of programming confidently and audiences being able to come back in terms of what we do is absolutely vital. And at the moment, we're going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And the uncertainty is really damaging, not just the business planning, not just the audiences, but is really damaging the artists. So certainty in terms of us being able to program the extraordinary work.
John, would it be for you? I know you want to go and have a cup of coffee in a cafe with somebody, but beyond the coffee, what would it be for you?
That's much too wild an ambition to have a cup of coffee in a cafe. I think, I think we're in danger of becoming completely subsumed in the online world, and of course, the relationship of art is always going to be human to human. But I think if there's one thing I'd like to see in the next 12 months, it's a real change in organizing the power of creative people to get their just rewards in the online world. And that seems hopeless at the moment, but it's not hopeless because it has been achieved in other areas. And there's lots of really innovative thinking going on in that space at the moment. We need to pull that together and really give it some clout in the next 12 months. If we're ever going to do it, now's the time to do it.
Yeah, so true. And Deeyah, I know you've got great plans for the next 12 months, but for you, what would you like to see achieved, or what would you like to achieve yourself if you were to choose just one thing?
I think a basic respect for freedom of artistic expression is an absolute necessity for a thriving and free and open cultural economy. And I think I would like to see a diversity of voices be something that is strengthened and supported in a way that it was not pre-COVID. So I hope that can be one of the things that actually emerges from this. And lastly, I would say more than anything, I desperately, desperately hope that we find a way of building more solidarity between artists and the various creative sectors globally. Because I think the challenges that we face, COVID has proven, are global. So I would like to see the solutions also be unified and in solidarity with each other, and not just think that as long as I can survive my own context, it's okay. Let my colleagues on the other side of the world just drown. We can't do that. This is a time where we have to shift how we actually behave with each other and how we support each other as well.
Well, it's changed so much, COVID, for cultural world, for the artists, for the institutions, for the people who are finding the money to help this work go on. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank our audience for participating. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, Deeyah Khan, John Newbigin, Vicky Featherstone. I'd like to particularly thank the Abu Dhabi Department of Culture and Tourism for inviting us all to be here, and also our other event partners who've helped so much to put this Culture Summit together. Do stay on. The next session, which starts in half an hour, will be on the crucial question of how to channel funding towards culture in post-crisis situations. Thank you all very much.